Thank you so much. Yeah, see, that's how it's done. Oh my, oh my, oh my. It warms my heart. It warms my heart to hear that. And thank you very much. And I hope you bring the same energy for everyone who comes up on stage today. As we mentioned yesterday, what we want to do at the Continuity Forum is look a little bit into the future, what's possible. And I'm really, really excited to be introducing our next guest because his expertise is in one of the most crucial areas where we need to be thinking about the world. Larry Summers is the former head of the National Economic Council. He's a former Secretary of the Treasury. He's a former president of my alma mater, Harvard, so I give him personal thanks. And he is probably the person most qualified to speak to us about the future of the global economy. So we are very, very honored to welcome to the stage Mr. Larry Summers.
Thank you very much. It is great to be here, and Derek, I appreciate that warm introduction. It's good to be introduced without an economist joke. It wasn't so long ago that I was introduced by the guy who said, "Larry, do you know what it takes to succeed as an economist?" And I said, "No." And he said, "An economist is someone who's pretty good with figures, but doesn't quite have the personality to be an accountant." That was in Russia. And no one got the joke. But I am glad to be here at this important forum and glad to have a chance to reflect on the future of the global economy. Now, often what I talk about when I'm asked to talk about the economic outlook is the recession we were in, the recession that we were coming out of, what the cyclical outlook is for the United States. And if you want to ask me questions about that after I finish, I'm happy to talk about it. But what I want to do instead this morning is take the long view and ask, when historians look back at our era, what will they remark on about the period during which we were all alive? And I would suggest that there are two related things that will define this era. The first is the transition to a knowledge economy and the information technology revolution. Think about it. We are all carrying no, they took mine away before I went out here so there wouldn't be interference with the microphone, so I can't reach for it. But you are all carrying smartphones. Your smartphone has more computing power in it than the entire Apollo program did that sent a man to the moon. If you had your choice, I live this, so I know the answer. If you had your choice, you could have full access to the Harvard libraries right nearby and no access to your smartphone, or access to your smartphone and no access to the Harvard libraries. I know which one you'd choose, and it wouldn't be the Harvard libraries. If you want to reach people all over this planet, you're better off with your smartphone than John Kennedy was with the White House communications system when he was president of the United States. These technologies are carrying with it vast scope for interconnection, vast scope for doing things that seemed unimaginable. Two important economists wrote a book 10 years ago where they tried to predict the future of the economy and tried to talk about what technology could and could not do. And they said it would be a long time before a computer had the integrative processing power necessary to make a left turn against ongoing traffic. Yet there exists today a Google automobile that drove from California to New York, going through green lights, stopping at red lights, accelerating through yellow lights, without being touched by a human hand. Says something about the power of information technology that many of you remember, will remember at least vaguely, the Korean air crash that took place at San Francisco Airport about 4 months ago. That was what's known as a good weather crash. What's a good weather crash? When it's foggy, the pilots are required to use the computers to do an automated landing. When the weather's good, they're allowed to do it themselves. And when they do it themselves, mistakes are more likely than when they let the computers do it. There are now programs that give psychiatric and counseling assistance. You say you're upset. They say, that must really be hard for you. You say it is. They say, why do you feel that way? They turn out to be a source of solace. In Japan, where the population is getting older, there are automated pets that provide companionship and provide company. Do have to be plugged in, but they don't have to be fed. It's easier. There are even programs now that can grade certain kinds of student papers and student essays more reliably than human beings do. That is, you give 5 people the same papers to grade, and you give it to the machine, and the machine will line up with 4 of the people more accurately than the 5th one will, on average. This is creating possibilities of a kind that we would not previously have imagined. That's the first big change in this moment. The second big change in this moment is the reconvergence of the global economy. For most of human history, all places were pretty much the same, and it was pretty grim. If you ask how much did standards of living increase from the time of Pericles in ancient Athens until London in 1800, they might have risen by as much as 50% over that 2,300-year period. The reason they called it the Industrial Revolution was that for the first time in all of human history, living standards were different at the end of a human lifespan than they had been before. Perhaps growth equal to the growth that had taken place since ancient Athens. It got faster. Growth was perhaps 4 or 5-fold in a human lifespan by the year 1900, when the United States was emerging as the world's largest economy. Today, in large parts of Asia over the last decade, growth has taken place at a pace where standards of living don't double in a lifespan. They double in less than a decade. And if you think about standards of living doubling in a decade, as they do at 7% a year, that's 7 doublings in a human lifespan. That's change in standards of living by a factor of more than 100. That's more than's taken place in the last 3 millennia. That's not just in one island off of Europe, but that's in places where 40% of humanity lives. And so we have the prospect of emerging markets truly emerging and a leveling up in the global economy over the next 2 generations. These 2 changes, tremendous power coming from technology, tremendous growth in emerging markets, carry with them enormous opportunity. It used to be that 1 in 6 children born on our planet died before the age of 5. It could easily be 1 in 50 within my lifetime. It used to be that a majority of people on the planet couldn't read. Within a decade, there'll be more cell phones on the planet than there are people. It used to be that the normal expectation for most people was a life of tedium and backbreaking labor, and that is being removed from the lives of most. It used to be that violence was the norm. In primitive societies, people have estimated that nearly 1/10 of the male adults were murdered each year. With progress, it gets much better. If you look at the fraction of the population of our planet that dies in war, over the last decade, it was 1/5 of what it was in the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s. And that, in turn, was vastly better than what humanity experienced in the first half of the 20th century. Technology, openness, greater sympathy and understanding of others, the emergence of a truly global economy based on knowledge. The two go together because it's really hard to ship an automobile, not that hard, but it's pretty hard to ship an automobile across continents, and it's impossible to ship a house across continents, but it's effortless to transfer an idea across continents. And so the more value resides in knowledge, the more integrated the global economy can become. That's why it's such an exciting moment to be alive. But, it is also true that with nuclear weapons, with what climate change can bring, for the first time in human history, mankind has the possibility of fundamentally altering the terms and conditions of life on Earth. And those are enormous risks. It is also the case that, as examples going back from Athens' rise and the reactions it generated in Sparta, to the experience of Germany's rise at the end of the 19th century, to the experience of Japan's rise in Asia in the 1930s, demonstrate there is no assurance that large changes in the distribution of economic power can be accommodated peacefully. It is also the case that large changes may have profound effects on the distribution of rewards. For those who are fortunate, their town used to be their oyster, and now the world is their oyster. For those with the ability to conceptualize a new product, the capacity to get that new product produced, implemented, and distributed so they can receive the rewards from it, are greater than they ever have been. But for those who lack those capacities, the risk that they will be substituted for by machines or by workers far away is that much greater. When I was a student a generation ago, the top 1% of the American population earned as much as the bottom quarter of the American population, and that seemed like a lot. Today, the top quarter of the population earns, as top 1% of the population earns as much as the bottom half of the population. 1% as much as 50%, and the trends continue. And so I would say to the young people in this room that you are going to inherit a global economy of unprecedented variety, unprecedented opportunity, unprecedented strength, but also a global economy with unprecedented risk, and that it will be your task to find the wisdom and the vision, the combinations of the public and the private sector, the sense of mission to assure that the opportunities vastly outweigh the risks going forward. Thank you very much for the chance to be with you.
Thank you so much. So we're going to have an opportunity for questions, so please raise your hand high. We'll bring a mic to you. There's a gentleman up there, and at least one more on the other side. Anyone? Okay. Okay, well, actually, you had one earlier, so we'll go with you back there for now. But while they're getting the mic set up, Secretary Summers, I wanted to ask you, that was an excellent presentation. Thank you so much for spending the time with us. One of the things that I'm curious about, this is something that I think about a lot, actually, is when you're looking at the future of the global economy, the kind of rapid change that you've talked about, and we put it in the context of what we see happening with global governance, and even some of the trends we've seen in the United States, the seeming to govern from crisis to crisis to crisis. Is it possible that our systems of governance are not adequate to deal with the pace of technological and economic change in the modern world?
Look, good things have a way of happening even when you don't see them. To take two examples, it's now pretty clear that the United States will be a net energy exporter within the next decade. That would have been inconceivable 5 years ago. It's now pretty clear that the growth in healthcare costs, which seemed to be an inexorable trend, has been bent. So never underestimate the power of a decentralized system that relies hugely on creative initiative and that makes that creative initiative possible to get things done. That said, I don't see how anybody can see the events of the last several months where we want a reprieve from the grotesque in terms of a debt default. I don't see how you can see the difficulty we have in the United States in passing obviously desirable immigration reform. I don't see how you can look at the fact that it is still possible for people with criminal records and mental illness to go to gun shows and purchase as many firearms as they want, and it's legal, not illegal. I don't see how you can look at all of that and believe that our system of governance is fully working. And I think there's no question that it has to be improved. And I think ours is one of the best in the world. And I think the challenge of better governance is there everywhere. I was just in China. At one level, because it's more authoritarian, they can get things done quickly. But the huge challenge that those in government in China have is how do you allow the openness that is necessary if you're going to have a well-functioning, continuing to grow, modern knowledge economy, and at the same time maintain the monopoly of the Communist Party on power. So, yes, I think that the realization of economic potential requires the evolution of government and political institutions. And that's a very important aspect of finding our way to the future.
Okay, thank you. Let's start with this question here. And please introduce yourself first.
My name is Damien. I'm with the New Leaders Council. And I wanted to touch on the point that you touched on last about kind of the 1% now being the 50%. And it feels like Washington has kind of taken up austerity. And I know that you've talked a lot about growth. And what we see in growth numbers is a lot of folks making $8 an hour as the new job numbers. And I just wanted to figure out what you thought, what policy initiatives we could implement to really transform these huge job numbers that we see being the $8 an hour to the maybe $15, $20, $25 an hour.
I'll give you three. The minimum wage should be higher than it is in the United States. It should be a principle of a just society that if you work full time, you can support a family of four above the poverty line. And that's a principle, and that principle should guide the minimum wage going forward. Second, we need a fairer tax system than the one we have. Corporations report more profits in the Cayman Islands than in China, more profits in Ireland than in Japan, and more profits in the Netherlands than in Germany. And that's for only one reason: taking advantage of tax havens. Why should Warren Buffett pay taxes at a lower rate than his secretary, if you think about it? And so a more progressive tax system is the second part of this. The third part of this, though, is these trends are not going to go away. What I described about technology is that is going to happen. And of all the things that concern me as I look at the American prospect, the one that concerns me most is a recent OECD study, but it's corroborated by other things, that suggests that mine is going to be the first generation of Americans who are as well educated as their children generation. And since George Washington, each generation has been better educated than the previous one. And that's the way it is in most other countries in the world. And unless we can fix that, given the changes in what types of work are going to be demanded, I think we're going to have a very difficult time getting to the kind of income distribution that we should want.
Let's take the second question right here.
Hi, my name is Leopoldo. I'm a teacher, and as a teacher, I believe that goodness without knowledge is weak, but knowledge without goodness is dangerous. So you mentioned a knowledge economy. How do we make this a knowledge and goodness economy? Thank you.
Leopoldo, thank you for what you do as a teacher. I used to, when my kids were younger and I lived in Washington, I would go watch their classes on Veterans Day each year and sit all day through a fourth grade class and then a fifth grade class and then a sixth grade class. And I can tell you that those teachers had a harder job than any of the jobs that I have had. And it is hugely important. It is hugely important work. You know, I think some of it goes to our educational system, but I ultimately think it goes to the way we bring up our children. And I think that it's the values that are instilled by parents that are going to be most important in that regard. And I think parents need to hold other parents to account. I think we need, it's not the kind of thing that progressives like me usually say, but I think we need to foster family values in our country. I think we need our leading figures to be models and examples for others. I've always had the view, though, that what's most important, maybe, for instilling ethical behavior is not stopping people from being unethical. Seems to me 5,000 years of human history suggests you're probably not going to succeed in doing that. But instead, what's the reaction of others in the surround? There were a lot of people in Germany in 1940 who knew what was going on, who didn't speak up. There were a lot of people at Enron who weren't doing anything wrong themselves, but knew that things that were wrong were going on, that didn't speak up. And it seems to me that the value that education needs to inculcate, and I think sometimes doesn't inculcate enough, is if you think the emperor's not wearing any clothes, always, always ask the question. And it seems to me if we can encourage that, we can create a culture in which the pressures for people to do the right thing will be that much greater. My old Harvard colleague, the late John Kenneth Galbraith, once said, conscience is the fear that someone is watching. And I think it was a perceptive observation.
Let's try to get one more. The young lady up there. Yourself, yes, you. We're coming to you. And while he's making his way there, I do want to ask a brief question. And you had mentioned immigration earlier. And I'm curious, we see that all the statistics indicate that the Latino demographic in the United States is going to be growing. It's the fastest growing demographic. Hispanic millennials are the fastest growing demographic. This is truly becoming a fully multicultural generation. I'm curious as to what your prognosis is for our relationship with Latin America, giving these changing demographics, and particularly if you think that we'll ever have a relationship on our southern border that is as benign as on our northern border.
I hesitate to come to Miami and to speak about these questions from Boston. It doesn't seem an entirely prudent thing to do. I'm optimistic about all this. I was just a few days ago in Mexico City. You know, after 100 years when it was different than this, over the last 5 years, the net flow of population has been from the United States to Mexico. And that's a reflection of the way in which opportunity has been created, particularly in the northern part of Mexico in these last years. After a period when it was a relationship which was dominated by discussion of the great sucking sound, and then a period when it was frankly dominated by discussions of narco-democracy, I think the relationship between the United States and Mexico is today in a better place than it's been in my professional lifetime. Look, I think this has enormous potential. There's an element in relations between the United States and Ireland, or between the United States and Poland, or more generally between the United States and Europe, that is very much shaped by the immigrant experience and the sense of continuing connection. And I think it has been, frankly, a feature of American foreign policy for the last 20 years that Latin America has been on the back burner. Now, in many ways, that's like a good thing. It's not a good thing to be on the back burner, but it's a good thing not to have the kind of events that have taken place in the Arab world. It's a good thing not to have the kind of phenomenon of rearming that you've had in Asia. It's a good thing not to have had the kind of disaster that for some years AIDS represented and civil war represented in Africa. So in many ways, it's been a reflection of the absence of egregious problem. But I do think that there are enormous shared opportunities in the Americas. When I worked for him, President Clinton declared a vision of free trade area in the Americas. And that hasn't really ever happened. And I think that's unfortunate, and I think at some stage, and I hope it comes soon, there will be more of a sense of shared enterprise with the Americas, and I think the changing demography of the United States will be a contributor to that. I would also just say, since it, I think connects with, it's not really what you asked about, but I think it connects with your question. There are very serious financial issues. This is what I actually do know about. Profoundly serious financial issues facing Puerto Rico right now. Puerto Rico's debt is trading as the junkiest of junk bonds right now that reflects a market's lack of confidence in the Puerto Rican economic enterprise and the capacity of the American system to support it. And how that's resolved is a very, very important question. It's a very important question for North America. It's a very important question for the Puerto Rican community in the United States. And it's probably the first issue where the presence of a substantial community in the 50 states would, I hope, have an important impact on an issue that lay outside the border of the 50 states.
I want to give you a chance to briefly ask your final question.
My name is Sasha Golem. I'm also a teacher. And I had two, let me just ask one short question. You talked about the value of knowledge and monetizing knowledge as being something that is part of the global economy and will create improvements. And it sounds really important and necessary. Could you explain it in more detail? I didn't quite catch it. In particular, with reference to the open source movement, which seems to be, on the surface, seems to be opposed to using knowledge to finance the global economy. Thank you.
Well, that's a big one. That's a big one and a deep one. Look, the rules on the ownership of land and how land could be transferred and how land could be sold and how the right to rent out the use of land could be given to sharecroppers were kind of the rules that set the framework of the agricultural economy. The rules of the common law corporation, in what ways a corporation could be sued, how would a corporation be taxed, how could a corporation, which after all isn't a person, enter into contracts. Those define the way the industrial world worked. And the rules and the institutions that we have around intellectual property will, I think, be defining of the knowledge economy. Knowledge is a different kind of good than other goods. It's the essence of my shoe that if I'm wearing it, you can't be wearing it. And so you have to have a property right, and you can't use my shoe without my permission, and you have to pay me if you want to buy my shoe or if you want to rent my shoe, and otherwise the whole thing wouldn't work. Ideas are different from that. I can use my idea, and you can use it too. The guy who invented quantum mechanics did good for himself, but he also changed the world in a huge way. And so the economic challenge, and it's not one I can make specific prescription for here, is how do you, on the one hand, give people an incentive to develop ideas? Because who would ever write a book if somebody could just copy it and sell it? On the one hand, you have to give people an incentive to have ideas. On the other hand, once the idea is there, you want as many people as possible to be able to take advantage of the idea. That's why patents exist for some interval, and they don't exist forever. And so I think that the right system involves a rather complicated balancing. My own judgment would be that there's a great deal of merit in the open source movement for many purposes. You know, when I was a kid, people would save for years. You know, I came from a upper middle class family, and an Encyclopedia Britannica probably cost more than a month of my father's salary. And my parents saved so we could have an Encyclopedia Britannica in our house. Wikipedia is much better and much more up to date than that Encyclopedia Britannica ever was, and that's a great triumph of open source. On the other hand, for certain things, you need to have incentives, and that means you need to be able to restrict access. And this is like most issues I've found in public policy are not black or white. The solutions don't lie at either corner or extreme, but they lie in finding the right balance in the middle. And that goes back to the first question that you asked, Derek, which is, can we find the public institutions and systems of governance that amidst all the clamor can find their way to a sensible center? And I think that's increasingly the question for politics in many parts of the world, including in Latin America. Thank you for the chance to be with you.